Dave, I'm a connoisseur of wine.
Yeah.
But this week, I've been tasting some different vintages. Rather than vintages of fine wine.
I have a guess. Robitussin A,
that's right.
Robitussin B,
That's
Robitussin
right.
D.
Exactly. Mix in a little Mucinex.
Yeah.
We're down with some bugs here. I got it first, and I think you have maybe the same thing I have. Head and chest congestion, but we are powering through. We know we don't have, well, I know I don't have COVID. I went and got the test. So the COVID bug has not gotten me. It's just a head cold that has turned into something deeper.
All you know is you don't have any of the COVID variants that they've detected yet. I mean, they're only a Delta, so maybe you have COVID Zeta, and 2 years from now you'll find out that
that's right.
Oh, I had COVID back in what is this? The last week of
version.
July of 2021. I dealing with the same thing. Both of us on antibiotics. Both of us met with our doctors. That whole novel concept of a private decision between you and your doctors. And you did the test, and I talked to my doctor about it. Got some antibiotics and went from there.
It's a strange thing in the world today. When I started feeling kind of rough last week, I did not call the governor. I didn't call the president. In fact, I called no politicians at all. But I did send an email to my physician.
I wonder if he'd called Fauci. He might have responded.
Maybe you never know.
He might have
responded.
So
we have to ask, for some indulgence from our audience. We're going to sound a little bit like who's the frog on the Muppets?
Kermit.
We're going to sound a little bit
Kermit.
like Kermit the Frog.
I'm today, instead of coffee, I've got some tea with honey in it. And I'm almost a little bummed about it. I think my voice is not too far from what it normally is.
Yeah.
I was kind of hoping I'd get to check off that bucket list item of knowing what I'd sound like as an old blues DJ from the
now you have
late
it.
night. But we'll see how this goes.
Oh goodness! All right. So a lot of things going on in the world right now, and for our members who are part of chapters, our Guardians and our Poor Richards, they will be meeting in a couple of weeks, having their case studies, talking about the idea of property. Mm-hmm. And of course, those case studies are always available for all of our digital subscribers as well. They can look at the documents and the video training that goes along with it. And in a way, that's such a big, sprawling subject, property. It really touches on virtually everything that is going on in politics, because everything that is going on in politics affects our property, properly understood. One of the big points we make in our case studies, and this is something really worth mentioning again, it's worth rethinking this through, letting this really absorb in. Dave, if I mentioned property, if I said, Dave, I think your property is important, or it's important that your property be protected, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, as most people, the first thing you think about is your home, your car, the items inside of it, maybe some of your childhood items, but they're usually physical
material things, right?
things.
Yeah. And I think that's the way most people think about their property. Things that you can touch, things that you could sell if you wanted to. And the founders, building on a philosophic tradition reaching back to John Locke and other thinkers, they had this much larger, much bigger, much more comprehensive and expansive understanding of property. Now, their view of property certainly included all those things. Your house, the land, maybe if you own the land that your house sits on, your computer, cars, clothes, right? All those material things.
James Madison probably would have loved to have a computer.
Yes, he would have. He maybe he could have kept up with Alexander Hamilton if he had a computer, but maybe not. And and here's another sort of obvious one that a lot of people forget: the money in your checking account. That is your property.
Sure.
It's just as much your property as your house or your car. But the founders included so much more in it. They started with the observation that the first property, the first kind of property every human being owns is himself.
Sure.
Your own person, and that means your physical body, that's yours. It doesn't belong to any other human being. It's rightfully yours. Your mind, your thoughts, your speech, the words that tumble out of your mouth, or if you write them down, or you're using a computer to type them out, that's yours. You own them. Anything that you produce with your hands, anything you make, you cultivate some land and some corn or wheat grows on it, that's yours. You build something that is yours. They even went so far, Madison had this beautiful little essay that we linked to in the case study on property, and he even described things, this is kind of counterintuitive, things like free speech, what we call the freedom of speech. He says that's your property. Not just the speech, but the freedom to speak as you please, that's yours. You own it. Religious liberty, your opinions about God, the way you choose to worship God or maybe choose not to, whatever that relationship is with God, that's yours. That's your property. It doesn't belong to any other person.
You could almost define that along with, and it would encompass some other things, but as the soul. Your soul is your property.
That's right. And your soul is yours. Everything about your person is your property. No other human being has a rightful claim to these things. And when you think through what that means, it means every kind of injustice, every violation, right, of a natural right is really a form of theft. I mean, theft, ordinary theft, right? Someone stole your bike not long ago. That was an act of theft. They stole property that rightfully belongs to you. But other things as well, physical assault, that is someone stealing your health. They're injuring you, right? They're taking away your health. We have laws rightfully against slander and libel, things like that, because when someone libels you or slanders you, they are stealing your good reputation. Right. Maybe you've spent a lot of time, you care about your reputation, you make good choices, you act justly and rightly, and you treat people fairly because you want to have a reputation for that. And then someone comes along and slanders you and says, oh, he is a liar and he's a cheat and he's terrible to people. They've stolen your reputation. All the way up to including things like murder. I mean, murder is, we certainly can think about murder in terms of property rights. It's someone who's stealing someone else's life, taking something that doesn't belong to the thief.
You talk about slander and libel, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have just in regard to what that debate looks like in a courtroom, right? If you try to sue me for slander and libel, my response is not going to be, I didn't say that. I mean, unless I didn't, right? If the person clearly has proof that I said that,
right, my
defense is, it's true, right? If I can prove you are a liar, you are those things,
right,
you have a history, then I didn't, because I didn't steal your good reputation. You didn't have a good reputation to begin with. So by me saying to you, you actually did lie, you actually did cheat, you actually did do those things, then I'm not stealing from you. So it kind of is that, it's a perfect way of understanding how that could be seen as theft in terms of a reputation. If you have that reputation of being a good person, a virtuous citizen, somebody who is self-restrained when appropriate and self-reliant, has all those things, and then I come in and say, no, you've been taking advantage of people. You're not self-reliant. Right. You've been taking advantage of people. You've been lying to them. You've been cheating them to get ahead. Well, now I am hurting your reputation. I am stealing from that reputation that you've chosen to build.
Boy, it's a great point. And there's a great story there. I think parts of it have been told. I don't know that anyone has told this story in an authoritative way. It maybe has been done, and I don't know about it. If anyone knows of any comprehensive, like book-length study of the transformation of law that happened in the course of the American Revolution and the early period of the American founding, protecting and respecting and acknowledging property rights in all these different areas, the change in laws regarding libel and slander are just a great example of that.
Right.
Under Old English law, and this was really true throughout medieval theocratic Europe, you could be prosecuted for slander or libel especially if it was against a government official. And the truth was not a defense.
Right.
It didn't matter if what you were saying was true. If it hurt the government in any way, you were guilty of libel or slander.
And I wouldn't go too far down this tangent, but it also was really different in the other direction. If the king, if the monarch said, Tom, you're a liar. You could have never told a lie in your life.
Right.
Tom, you're a liar. That was considered fact. That came from God himself.
Right.
That is fact. Tom, you are now officially branded a liar. You can't go to the king and say, hey, I've never lied in my life.
Right.
I'm George Washington. I cannot tell a lie,
Right.
Like, this is, as far as that monarchist attitude was,
Yep.
If the king said you were something, if he challenged your reputation, if he decided to destroy your reputation, it was gone and you couldn't do anything about it.
It was gone. It was an act of theft, and there really was no legal remedy. And so in that whole realm of libel and slander, I mean, the Americans make this incredible reformation of the laws, respecting property based on the truth. Whenever there was an accusation of slander or libel, they said, well, the first question is, was it true? What was actually said or written? There were other important changes. We don't talk about this in the case study, but there's sort of the important historical backdrop. Under old European feudal law, English feudal law, it included laws like entail and primogeniture. Entail was a law that said this appealed to applied to real estate, real property. It had to be kept intact, entail, because under medieval law, there was really only one true property owner, the sovereign, the crown, the king.
The landlord.
He was the ultimate landlord, and it's medieval law that we get that term from, the landlord, because the king owned it all. And so that was an important foundation for his political sovereignty. The land was his. Now, this led to so many important, not just legal, but cultural, and this affected the way people live, including things like where we get the notion of birthright citizenship, this very disputed idea that someone born on American soil, right, even if their parents are not legally here, should instantly be a citizen. That has its roots in medieval law that said, well, if the ground, the dirt, is owned by the king, then any child born on English soil, didn't matter who his parents were, didn't matter if his parents were there legally or not, the baby becomes a lifelong subject to the king. And so what we call birthright citizenship really has its origins in birthright subjectship. The other piece of entail was, go ahead.
I have a question about that, because you've studied this a lot more than I've ever looked into it. And was there something in that time, or has there been something over the years about a sense of competition, a sense of accomplishment? I mean, I would assume there was. The larger the numbers of subjects a king had, right? Was there some, especially within, does that make sense? Especially like within the chain of history of, say, English kings. Would one king say, I'm more powerful than that king was because I have more subjects, I have more people?
Oh, I see.
I'm curious if I've never looked into that.
Well, I think so, because it ultimately was about control, right? There really was no notion, what we call citizenship here. And this is another whole line of thought that is worthy of its own podcast sometime. What we call citizenship, in principle, should be based on consent.
Right.
Because we Americans make this argument is right there in the Declaration of Independence. If all men are created equal, if all human beings have the same equal natural rights, then the only legitimate government is one where people come together and they make an agreement, just like in starting a business or a club or any organization, right? It's only legitimate if we all agree to it.
Sure.
It's not legitimate. No organization is legitimate if you point a gun at someone else's head and say, you have to be part of this. You have to sign off on, right? That's not legitimate. So consent should be the centerpiece of citizenship. Under medieval feudal law, it was really about control. It was about power over people. And if you're born on my land and I'm the sovereign crown, I control you. And it also means I really control your life. I control your property. So feudalism, where they would make these arrangements. People would farm the land and cultivate crops and things, and they would get to keep a little bit for their own sustenance to live on.
Sure.
But they didn't own the crops they were growing. And for that matter, the barons and lords, they didn't own it either. They were not free to sell part of it off to Disneyland to develop a theme park, right? Or a home builder to build track homes.
Right.
Because that would diminish the sovereign king's power. His realm of sovereignty would get smaller if he allowed people to sell off the land. So all the land really belonged to the king. The Americans, within the first decade after the Revolution, they get rid of all state laws of entail. There are no more laws. Your property is really your property.
Sure.
You can keep it, you can sell it, you can chop it into smaller parts and sell different pieces off. It's yours. Do with it what you want. Another legacy of that medieval just gross betrayal of property were laws of primogeniture, which said that the management of a land under a king would be handed down to the firstborn son, usually because those barons and dukes and other titles within the bloodline of the king. And so he wanted all those managers, all those landlords to be part of the bloodline that reinforces the sovereignty of the king. Americans get rid of that. They say your property is your property. You don't have to give it to your firstborn son. You do with it what you want.
I think that's an important conversation to have, because I've heard people on the opposite side of the argument from us make the argument that that's why we should have massive taxes on estate taxes. And I even had somebody at one point in time, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, say to me, no, if somebody dies, all their possessions should be given to the government.
Yeah.
And there should be no pass along. And they made the argument that the Americans tried to make back in the 1700s. The difference was you owning your own property, and this is what I tried to explain to him. We could never get on the same page, but you owning your property, it's your property to do whatever you want with. If you do want to give that to your son or daughter, if you do want to give that to a family member, a brother, a nephew, a niece, whatever it might be, you're welcome to do that. And it's not just automatically passed down. It's not guaranteed to pass down. The problem where he missed and the conversation where we could never get on the same page was he assumed that it was the government's property. He had to. For him to make the argument that this is going back to the government, right?
It started with the government. It
started with the government. The government made it possible for you to have it, and therefore you have to give it back when you die.
Yep.
Right? You're just getting it alone. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's no different than living under a monarchy.
I used to have a big map. I don't have it here, so I'll just try to get our listeners to visualize it. Imagine a big map. And this was an actual old-fashioned kind of vinyl map that folded up, and I would unfold it in the classroom and hang it from the chalkboard.
I know the exact map you're talking about.
And what it was it showed the United States, and it had all the privately owned land in green and government-owned public land in red. And it really is the story of property rights in American history, because, for our viewers here, if you think of the United States, this would be the East Coast over here, that would be the West Coast over there. The eastern half of the United States, the older part, it's almost all green. It was almost all privately owned. There are little tiny dots, parks and things like that, government buildings. That was it. On the western half of the United States, the vast majority of it is red. Well, we're here in Colorado. Lots and lots of federally owned land here. You get into Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, huge stretches of land. I think in Nevada, something like 80 to 85% of the state of Nevada is actually owned by the United States government, by the federal government.
So I know the exact map you're talking about, but I don't remember the date of that map. Are we talking early American history or
what I'm
modern?
saying is the older part. So, when you go back to the time of the founding, through the early part of the 1800s, we hadn't even settled the western part of the United States yet. Almost all land was privately owned. And that also means it was cultivated, it was taken care of because people owned it. They wanted to improve it, maybe make a profit on it. When you get into the more modern states that don't come into existence until the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that's after progressivism has really shot through the United States. That's when you start to see huge chunks of land are now publicly owned.
Sure.
And really the premise there is when a state would come in, a newer state, this really all belongs to the government. The government will decide what will be privately owned and what won't. That was not the view at all at the time of the founding. No Virginian thought that the federal government owned all the land in Virginia and has to give it back. It was considered to be private property.
I asked the question because I'm thinking through the conversations that were going on with the Missouri Compromise, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We have all this new land, the Louisiana Purchase, all of this new land. You still have some of the conversations about the agreement between the American Indians and Thomas Jefferson. It started with George Washington through Thomas Jefferson. That was sort of ripped up and thrown away by Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
But a lot of the federal land, the government-owned federal land that you're talking about on that map is all stuff that came about during some of that time, right? The Louisiana Purchase and things like that. And you think about the role that slavery played in determining, well, who should own the land and how is it going to be controlled and what laws are going to apply to it, on and so forth.
That's right, absolutely. And it points to this whole subject of regulatory control over the land. Now, back then, there were virtually no regulations. And in terms of law, and we, of course, at the Vino Veritas Society, we make a big distinction between laws and regulations. They're two very different things. But even in terms of law, there was very little restriction on how people could use their own land, what they could do with it. The big fight in the middle part of the 19th century was over slavery.
Right.
They said, okay, how about this one thing? You're free to do whatever you want with your land. You can sell it, you can keep it, you can farm it, not farm it, do whatever you want. But you don't get to kidnap other people and keep them on your land. You can't do that. And let's be real clear. Slavery itself is a gross immoral violation of property rights.
Right.
Kidnapping is arguably one of the grossest forms of theft. You're stealing another human being. And that's what slavery is, just an ongoing act of kidnapping. And so people like Lincoln, the Republicans, were making this argument saying, we want a law that prohibits that. Right. You can do anything else you want with your land, but come on, you can't kidnap other human beings and keep them on your land.
It's worth emphasizing that. And we've talked about this repeatedly throughout Vino Veritas content, Vino Veritas Society content for the last year. But I think it's always worth going back to. The slave being tied to a tree and whipped still has rights.
Absolutely.
That act of chaining the slave to the tree in itself is theft. The act of whipping that slave is theft. And the potential act of murdering that slave is theft. And anything else that was done is a form of theft because that slave has property in his individual natural rights.
And all those injustices to the slave, they are morally wrong.
Right.
Because that slave has the same natural rights as every other human being. That slave may not have any legal rights. The law may not respect those rights, but that means the laws are wrong. The laws are defective. The laws need to be changed. They need to be improved because that slave does, in fact, actually have a natural right to his own life, liberty, property, and the free pursuit of happiness. And slavery is just a gross, terrible, immoral violation of property rights. So that was the big fight in the middle part of the 19th century that culminates in the Civil War is we have this private property out there, but we want the law. The Republican side was we want the laws to say you can't kidnap human beings or buy human beings and use force and chains and whips and guns and keep them there, make them work for you and own them and then buy them and sell it. That's not property. A human being can't be property by definition. Mm-hmm. That was the Republican position. That was Abraham Lincoln's position. Great respect for property rights, but there is no property in a man. Can't happen. A man cannot be property. A human being can't be property. Now we fast forward in our case study. We talk about a number of violations of property rights in our modern world today. And one of them we touched upon, which has roots going all the way back to the Civil War and that fight over slavery, are public accommodation laws. Public accommodation laws are laws that say, we in the government have designated your business as a public accommodation.
Right.
And so we're going to tell you with whom you must trade, that you may not discriminate, you may not choose. And it's a violation of property rights in so many ways, and it's so misunderstood. I'll talk more about these various kinds of laws in a minute. But we have to address, first of all, just this basic term that has come to be the term discriminate or discrimination. It's a perfectly legitimate old word in the English language. To discriminate means to choose between options. Mm-hmm. If I placed in front of you 3 different candy bars, I said, Dave, you're free to take one. You know what you would do? You would discriminate. Yep. You would choose the one that you like, and you would not choose the ones that you don't like. Every time you go out to eat, you discriminate. When you choose what kind of clothes to buy or not buy, or what kind of car to buy or not buy, you are discriminating. We used to use that phrase. We'd say a refined man or woman has discriminating tastes, meaning right. They know how to select wines and food and things like that.
There's been an attempt to move away from that because that word has gotten so many other things, and now we use the word discerning. You have discerning taste. Discerning. It really means the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so that word discriminate, I think for an entire generation of younger Americans today, they assume discrimination is unjust. It is something bad. Right. It's something you're a bad person if you've discriminated. Well, not really. You can discriminate in unjust ways, but discrimination itself simply means that you are making choices between options.
It also just means that you're making choices and that there are going to be results from those choices, right?
That's right.
And those choices can be good or bad. It's another conversation I like to have with people about the word consequences, right? I think for most young people in the country today, you hear the word consequences, you think immediately of a bad thing, right?
A punishment.
It's a punishment.
Yes.
Your parents, when you were being raised, if you do that, there will be consequences.
Right.
Consequences aren't always bad. Consequences are if you're a restaurant and you keep great health standards and you put out great food and your service is great, the consequence of that is that you're going to get more customers. You're going to be more successful. You can charge more prices. You're going to be more profitable, if I can even say that word in today's world. But you're going to be more profitable. You're going to be more successful.
Yep.
People are discriminating and choosing to come to your restaurant as opposed to another. And there's positive consequences, right? So in the same way.
Rewards.
Right.
Rewards are consequences.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so here's what we have. The sort of the big granddaddy of all public accommodation laws is Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Right.
1964 Civil Rights Act was a big piece of federal legislation. There are actually 7 different sections, 7 different titles to it. Title II is the one that deals with public accommodations. Now, it's a very curious thing. Oh, I should add on to that. And then the states have created their own. Today, 45, almost all, 45 out of 50 states have state-based, some kind of public accommodation, anti-discrimination law. And what these do, all these laws, they identify certain types of businesses, restaurants, hotels, retail stores, things like this. And the government designates them public accommodation. Now that in fact in itself is sort of curious. You might be the owner of a restaurant or a bar or a hotel, and you might say, No, my purpose is not to offer accommodations to the public. My purpose is to offer accommodations to my friends or my relatives or to people I like. Or it's your property. You should be able to choose to whom you want to offer your services or your products. But the government has said, no, we are designating your business as a public accommodation, and therefore you may not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, national origin. There's a couple of other criteria. This is where we get cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop.
Right.
These all revolve around these public accommodation laws. So a couple guys want Jack Phillips to bake a cake, and Jack Phillips says, no, I don't want to bake that kind of cake for that reason, declines the offer, and they file a lawsuit. You have discriminated against us based on sexual orientation or something like that. And what almost never gets discussed are the public accommodation laws. In that case of Masterpiece Cake Shop, Colorado has an anti-discrimination public accommodation law. It's very similar to the Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, very similar. And here in Colorado, that law also created a Civil Rights Commission. There are these commissioners, these bureaucrats who sit, and they're the ones who are going to enforce these terms on Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop. Now, there are a couple of things about this. First of all, we should point out, Dave, I've almost come to dislike the term business. And here's why. When you really think about purchasing something, it's not that the business is the seller and the other party is the buyer. It's a trade.
Right.
I mean, right, if I go into a restaurant, one way to describe the transaction, the exchange, would be to say that Tom purchased a sandwich with his cash. But it would be equally legitimate and equally accurate to say the restaurant purchased Tom's cash with a sandwich.
Right.
Right? We both offered something. That guy said, I got a sandwich here, and I said, I got some money here, and we agreed to make the trade. Because I wanted the sandwich more than the cash I had in my pocket, and he wanted my cash more than the sandwich. So it's a trade. But public accommodations don't treat them that way. They don't treat both parties equally. They say, if you are in one of these designated businesses, you may not discriminate. However, everyone who goes out shopping with cash in their pocket, they discriminate in all kinds of ways. As they back out of their driveway, say someone's going to go shopping on a Saturday afternoon, as they back out of their driveway and they start thinking in their head which stores they're going to go to, which also includes which stores they're not going to, they're discriminating right there, right? And then once they get into the store and they start deciding which things they're going to buy and which things they're not going to buy, they're discriminating in all kinds of ways. So what these public accommodation laws do, they don't say citizens may not discriminate. They say a certain class of citizens whom we have designated businesses or business owners and certain kinds of businesses, we're going to tell them they don't get to choose with whom they trade. Everybody else gets to choose with who they trade.
I'm going to pull that string a little further and say that you didn't go far enough.
Okay.
The reality is today in the current progressive world we live, they are telling us to discriminate if we are the buyer. If we are the person with cash, we are hearing from government, you should discriminate. We are going to create an entire month where we're going to say you should buy more from black-owned businesses.
Right.
We're going to create another month. You should buy more from or exclusively from gay-owned or LGBTQ-owned businesses.
Right.
You should always buy less from white privileged businesses. I mean, they are actually telling us to discriminate, but they would never call it that. They would never actually come right out and say, we want you to discriminate a little bit more with your buying power.
Every boycott, whether including the ones people like and the ones they don't like, every boycott is an act of discrimination, right? You are choosing among alternatives.
Sure.
And here's the real rub. Here's sort of the big point I say for the end that I want to make about this. These laws were justified originally beginning with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They were justified by saying these are necessary to remedy the problems stretching back through Jim Crow all the way back to slavery. That if we don't have these laws, Black Americans especially, there's no way that they can get along, no way that they can thrive and flourish. They need these kinds of laws. And here we see this really ugly, cynical Machiavellian side of the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party, going all the way back to the times of Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party was formed to protect slavery. I mean, it's really fascinating. The writers at the 1619 Project have just bald-faced lied and said America was founded to protect slavery, which was not at all true. There's all kinds of evidence that colonists before the Revolution were trying to scale back slavery, and it was the British government wouldn't let them. But we do know of an organization that was formed to protect slavery. It's the Democratic Party, was founded in 1828 in large measure to protect the slave interest. This is true all the way through the Civil War. Everyone who was pushing back against Abraham Lincoln were pro-slave Democrats. After they lost the Civil War, they lost the fight over slavery, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Then we get into the whole period of the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s and 80s and 90s into the early part of the 20th century, which was really an extension of the Democratic Party. It was a militarized domestic terrorism group targeting mainly Black Americans, but also Republicans. It was part of the Democratic Party. This was their whole purpose, right? Keep blacks down, control them, enslave them, terrorize them, lynch them, burn their homes down, don't let them vote, come up with ridiculous voting laws so that they can't vote, intimidate them at the polling places so that they don't show up to vote. And then in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, Democrats start realizing this isn't working. Like we are losing public sentiment. The calls for Black Americans to just live freely under the laws is growing and growing. We got to change sides. And so they come up with Title II in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And they say, okay, Black people want us to stop controlling them, terrorizing them, enslaving them. Well, here's what we'll do. We will scale back those things. Scale back, not end them completely. Just the Ku Klux Klan continued after the 64 Civil Rights Act.
Sure.
We'll scale it back if we get to take control over private businesses across America. We Democrats in government, we want control over private businesses. That's what those public accommodations basically do. That's why there's now civil rights commissioners harassing, little Jack Phillips trying to run a cake shop. And it's all built on a lie. When you look back at, there's no dispute that Black Americans suffered terribly under slavery. They suffered under Jim Crow. I mean, horrific, ugly things. The old blues singer, oh, now I can't remember her name. She had that, it's a beautiful and dreadful song, Strange Fruit. Billie Holiday.
Billie Holiday.
Old blues singer. Yep. And the strange fruit she was singing about were lynchings. You would drive down a country road and you'd come across a tree and there'd be 4, 5, 6 bodies, including babies, corpses swinging from the tree, and it looked like strange fruit. This is what was happening. It was horrific. It was ugly. It was a nightmare. It was a hell on earth. And for blacks suffering that kind of injustice, their big problem was not that the owner of the diner wouldn't allow them to come eat. That was not their big problem. In fact, we have all kinds of historical records that when the white owners of restaurants and bars and hotels wouldn't allow blacks in, you know what the blacks did? Black Americans? They started their own. They were opening up their own restaurants and bars and hotels and barber shops and clothing stores and grocery stores, all kinds of things. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a whole section of town they called Black Wall Street.
Right. Because
there was such a concentration of enormous wealth, and it was by Black families. They were incredibly productive and profitable. And so the point is, no, you actually don't need. If someone said, I'm a white guy and I own this restaurant and I'm not going to let black citizens eat in there. Okay, don't do it. Someone else, whether it's a white person or a black, somebody else is going to say, I've got a restaurant. You're welcome to come down and eat. I will happily serve you because somebody else wants to make money. This story played it out in the most visible, grand way in the realm of baseball when Jackie Robinson got hired by the Brooklyn Dodgers, and there was no public accommodation laws, right? There was no law saying baseball teams have to hire certain numbers of players of different colors. One team said, we think this guy's really good and he's going to make us better. And what was his name? Hired Jackie Robinson.
From the Dodgers.
Branch Rickey. Hires Jackie Robinson, and they become a superstar team. And all of a sudden, other teams say, we want to compete, and we know there's some really, really good players in what was then called the Negro League, and they started hiring them.
Yep.
And there were a few holdouts. There were a few white supremacists, racist bigots who said, no way, we're never hiring a black. Okay, don't hire black players. And those were the teams that just started sucking year after year after year.
You brought up sports, and we have a few minutes. One of my favorite movies of all time, and it's been out long enough. I'm going to give some spoilers. I hope I don't ruin this for people.
Okay.
It's still worth watching even if I spoil it.
Last week we gave a spoiler for Schoolhouse Rock, so we can.
This is a little more modern than that. But there was a movie called The Express.
Okay.
Did you ever see The Express?
I don't think so.
The Express is the Ernie Davis story. Ernie Davis was a black running back who followed Jim Brown at Syracuse.
Okay.
And Syracuse was one of the first college football programs in the country to start to integrate. And Jim Brown comes on, and if anybody knows anything about Jim Brown, he's arguably one of the greatest athletes, period.
Right.
And obviously one of the greatest football players of all time. He was also an All-American lacrosse player at Syracuse. So they integrated both sports, bringing Jim Brown and a few others. Jim Brown plays 4 years at Syracuse. Ernie Davis comes in for the next 4 years. And then, we're in Colorado. Floyd Little came in after Ernie Davis. Floyd Little goes on to the NFL Hall of Fame, the Broncos Ring of Fame. He's one of the greatest players in the Broncos, in the history of the Broncos organization. But the Ernie Davis story is this story of Ernie Davis, who arguably was better than Jim Brown. He had everything you look for in the perfect running back, could do everything. There were times he'd go in on defense just because he was so athletic and so much better than everybody on the field.
Right.
He says, no, we need a turnover. I'm going in on defense.
Right.
But towards the end of the movie, they win the Cotton Bowl. They win the national championship. This is all historical record.
Yeah.
So they win the national championship, and he is the MVP of the Cotton Bowl. And the club where they're supposed to get their award is a whites-only club.
Yep.
And instead of this club getting to host one of the greatest football teams in the history of college football, and one of the greatest players ever to play college football, since they wouldn't let him in, the whole team said, you know what? We're going to go find another place. And they found a barbecue and blues bar in North Texas.
Did their award ceremony there.
Celebrated. The band brought them up on stage. They were singing. They were dancing, having a great time. I'm just thinking, that's what you do.
Yep.
When somebody doesn't want you, you don't need them. You go have fun yourself, and they're the ones missing out.
And so this is the point. Almost no one today is willing to stand up in public and challenge these public accommodation laws.
Right.
No one's willing to challenge Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and we're challenging it. I'm saying there's a real problem there. It's a violation of property rights. And of course, many people immediately recoil and say, "Oh my goodness, are you saying that a business owner should be allowed?" And I stop. Hold on. First of all, a business owner is a property owner. Mm-hmm. And when you say should be allowed, who are we to allow, right, to grant permission to what other people? Anybody should be able to do with their own property what they want to do. We get to choose who we invite into our homes and who we don't. And if you call a piece of your property your business, it should be the same thing. And to your point about consequences, and take the consequences. If you want to be known as a real discriminatory, narrow-minded, hateful little person, and there's all kinds of groups of people you won't let into your business, okay. And everybody's going to know about that. And everybody's going to talk about that.
Yep.
And a whole lot of people are going to say, screw that guy. He's a hateful, mean little bigot. I'm going somewhere else. These things tend to work themselves. If someone really is a mean, hateful little bigot, do you really want to go to his store if he only is inviting you in because the law is pointing a gun at his head and making him, right? You don't want to go there anyway.
That's who you want to give your money to.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one of these great, violations of property rights, and we see it in these high-profile cases. Every time there was a case with a photographer, there was a case with a pizza shop, it usually involves business owners declining some offer to do an exchange. And it involves these public accommodation laws. And very quickly, what happens almost all the time, we see this in the case of Jack Phillips, the whole conversation gets derailed by focusing on the subject of Jack Phillips' religious beliefs. Well, he's a Christian and they're beating him up, harassing him because of his religious faith. And in a way, that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if Jack Phillips was an atheist. I mean, he could be any religion or no religion at all. The point is his cake shop, his building, everything in it, the ovens and the flour and the sugar and the cream and all that stuff to make cakes, that's his property.
Right.
He's free to choose to exchange it with someone, and someone else is free to accept or decline the offer.
The comparable I always make, just personally, is kosher delis. Right? I mean, there are communities, there's part of my community that they need those restaurants because they have nowhere else to eat if they want to go out. And what if the government just came in one day and said, you got to start serving ham. You got to start serving cheeseburgers.
Right.
Too bad. There are going to be customers who want to come in here and they have dietary desires that you have to fulfill.
Right.
You can't discriminate in your food.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, a kosher deli has to start serving a ham and cheese sandwich? It doesn't work. I think we'd also be doing this conversation a disservice, and I know we're coming up on time, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but schools were the other area, right? That in 64, sort of or in the 60s, the forced integration really took away from, and I'm forgetting the name of the schools, but we've talked about in the past the group of private schools for black students.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And how exceptional they were.
Well, this was I'm forgetting his name. This involved Booker T. Washington.
Right.
Booker T. Washington. What a guy. There's someone we should spend more time talking about, Booker T.
Absolutely.
He's kind of a later, he's got a lot of Ben Franklin in him. There's some real parallels between Ben Franklin and Booker T. Washington that we should explore at some point. But he teams up with a Jewish financier.
He was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck at the time.
That's right. And they build schools across the South. This is in the peak of Jim Crow and Ku Klux Klan, all that bad stuff is happening in the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s. And they're building thousands, 5,000 schools they build, and they were great schools. They were actually had a solid curriculum. They were teaching the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic. They were teaching manners. They were teaching they were teaching the moral law. They were teaching how to be productive. They were fantastic. Black Americans, even in the worst of times, managed to flourish as long as they had some modicum of freedom.
Right.
And so it's such a lie for Democrats and progressives to come along and say, well, the only way that Black Americans can possibly flourish and get along is if we take control over private property, over private businesses. And so I'm suggesting to people flat out, we start looking very seriously at, I would repeal them. There is not a state in the country today, there is not one state that prohibits any class of citizens from voting based on things like skin color or gender. Not one. You can't find a state that has a law that says women can't vote, or blacks can't vote, or Catholics can't vote, or Jews can't vote. There's nothing like that. And so there is not one state that has laws that don't allow groups of people of certain skin color to sit on juries or to run for office or any of these sort of things, file lawsuits against each other. Our civil rights are quite intact and they're accessible to everybody. I would actually start getting rid of these so-called public accommodation laws, these Civil Rights Act, because they're not really civil rights acts. What they are is they're a government grab over private property.
Right. Well, I think that's why we will continue to be the guardians. That's why we do what we do and start helping people continue to see what this country should look like were we to achieve the goals of the Declaration of Independence.
We're going to go make a hot toddy, and then we're going to keep guarding the American idea, Dave.
Nos sumus custodes.